All right, American federal government. We're on chapter 6, which deals with public opinion. Public opinion, of course, is crucial in governance, and any good politician is going to pay particular attention to public opinion. So, for example, right now, we're in the midst, or the very beginning of a presidential campaign. As you know by now, the two nominees almost certainly going to be Biden and Trump. And you can bet they're paying particular attention at polling and what is important to voters, and they're going to target those things. So, of course, Republicans and Trump are going to try to prioritize the border because they believe that they have a stronger position on that. And in fact, they torpedoed a potential bill to secure the border because, as Trump had mentioned, that would hurt them in their election chances. So they think that arguing on the border is going to really help them. And Democrats are going to try to point to the economy. You know, 2 or 3 years ago, especially, it was the inflation was a huge issue and was a detriment to President Biden and to the Democrats because they're the ones that are in control of the White House. But the economy might be something they want to push. Another polling thing that I think about is abortion. So Democrats believe now that they have a winning hand with abortion because abortion's been so restricted, and polling does show that the majority of Americans support abortion rights, and they're really fearful of the growing restrictions in so many states on abortion. So you can see Democrats are going to try to push that. The whole point of all of this is that with regards to polling, is that it's really important as people try to win elections, and the different political parties try to win elections and prioritize things like that, and they pay close attention to that for sure. There's also a lot in this chapter about political socialization, and that's your assignment this week. Think about the things that influence you and the things that help to mold your political beliefs. Was it your family? Is it the news media, social media? Is it your peer group? Is it your church? Is it your education? Because all of those things really impact how you view politics. And for your essay, you want to kind of discuss each of those and then kind of discuss which ones you think has had the greater influence on your political socialization. And sometimes that means you're not very political at all, perhaps because you grew up in a family that wasn't political, and so you hadn't paid much attention to it. And a lot of you are really young. Some of you are still in high school, so you're still forming your political opinions. How are those opinions being formed? What's having the greatest influence over you on those opinions? I certainly think that the mass media, Fox News especially for older people, has had an outweighed influence on people. It most certainly has. But other things are huge factors as well. And it's not always the family, because a lot of times young people have different political opinions than their parents as well. So a lot of different factors go into that. And that's reflected in polls. Because if you look at post-election polls, so for example, people with college education are far less likely to support Trump. African Americans are far more likely to support the Democratic Party and Biden, so that has a lot to do with it. Evangelicals would be more likely to support Trump. So that type of identification, that has an influence over who people support based on identification as much as anything. Identification, that is religion, ethnicity, and social class, and education status, that has as much to do with who people pick to vote for as ideology now, which is different and is a little bit frightening because people are putting themselves into groups and they're not voting on policies and what they think is the right policies. Often they're voting on how they identify themselves. So we also, when we talk about polling as well, we talk about the accuracy of polling. And I think that's covered in this chapter. I'm just trying to check government opinion, public response, surveys. Yeah, so we measure public opinion through polling, and polling takes a lot of criticism as being, oh, the polls are wildly inaccurate. So the last part of this introduction to this chapter, I want to tell you, polls are pretty darn accurate. And if you look at the polling before both the 2016 and 2020 elections, they were pretty spot on. In other words, they had predicted that Hillary would win by about 3% nationally, and she did with the popular vote. But that doesn't mean she's going to win the Electoral College by any means. Same thing with Biden. They had predicted 4 or 5%, and he won by 4 or 5%. If you look and you study sampling and representative sampling, the larger the sample, the more accurate the poll's going to be. And where you run into problems is when you get some of these states, so for example, before the 2016 elections, Wisconsin didn't have really good polling, didn't have a large representative sample, and so there was a larger margin of error. So when they said, oh, Hillary will probably win that, it's 49, 47%, pretty sure she's going to win, but the margin of error is like 5%. So it's within that margin of error. And what we found in both 2016 and 2020 is Trump voters tended to be underrepresented in the polls because they were more likely to refuse to answer it because Trump had sown distrust in the media and distrust in polls. So statisticians and political scientists had to go back and revamp their models to try to account for the fact that Trump voters were more likely. But overall, in the end, they're pretty darn accurate. The polling tends to be within that margin of error. But that doesn't mean they're going to be absolute 100% by any means. But I'm always amazed that you have the polling and then you get to the election and it's pretty spot on, again, within that margin of error. But it gets difficult, and they mentioned historical examples. So for example, with Franklin Roosevelt in the 36 election, it was expected to be real close, but telephones were pretty new, and a lot of poor people didn't have access to telephones, and the polling was done exclusively through telephones. And so it really underrepresented Franklin Roosevelt's support. So how the poll is conducted, but if the poll is conducted randomly and scientifically, then it's far more likely to be accurate. But you got to watch for polls, because sometimes there's something called push polls, and those are polls actually administered by political candidates in order to try to sway your vote. So they would start something like, if the election were held today, who would you vote for, Biden or Trump? And then if the respondent says Trump, then they'd say, if you knew that Trump was a pedophile, would you still vote for him? And I could set this up the other way, if they answered Biden, if you knew Biden was a pedophile. In other words, it's called push polling because they're trying to push you to vote the other way. And those are not scientific. Those are actually very manipulative, and it's just, and politicians do that as well. So politics definitely can be a dirty game. It's sad that it's just become so much. It just gets worse and worse, and unfortunate. It's very, very unfortunate. And 2024 doesn't look to be any better. But public opinion plays a huge role in the way it sways. And how that will sway as we go forward into 2024, we'll have to wait and see. So that's chapter on public opinion.